So let's talk about Machiavelli philosophy. Now, I use the term Machiavellian a lot, but what does it mean? What does it really mean? And what has Machiavelli taught me? Or what has Machiavelli taught us? Is Machiavelli a good philosopher? And what is good philosophy? Let's go to whiteboard animation. Now, a lot of people have settled on the notion that Machiavelli is evil. And this statement in itself compels us to define what is evil. And I have argued historically that Machiavelli may not be evil. He just simply provides a commentary on how to cope in what many perceive to be an evil world. And again, the definition of evil is subjective. It's subjective and often used in a hyperbolic way. But is Machiavelli relevant in the modern day context? And what did Machiavelli actually teach? What is his political philosophy? And is his teachings, or are his teachings, valuable? And what did he endure to develop such ideas? So this is just my understanding of Machiavelli. So let's put on our philosophy shoes and go on this journey. And with that being said, let's analyze this train of thought accordingly. Now, Machiavelli, he wrote the book The Prince, and this book was written in 1513, but was released after his death. Now, this book is considered by many as one of the most influential books in political philosophy, and that by itself is significant. It has sold millions worldwide, and it has a cultural and a political influence. Now, I think it's important to give some context, because this book was written for a prince. So the book was written with the philosophy of not only how to get power, but how to sustain it. Now, what does that mean? It means contextually, this is a different type of book. Now, I understood the context before I read this book. I understood that this book spoke openly. It spoke openly about manipulation and openly about deceit. So let's analyze one of the quotes. Quote, "Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception." End of quote. Now, we can get some real insight from this. First, it appears that Machiavelli feels that deception is more powerful than force. Secondly, there is an omission that deception is an acceptable tool to use. At the very least, it's an acceptable tool to use within the context of a prince. So let's go to another statement. Quote, "Power is the pivot on which everything hinges. He who has the power is always right. The weaker is always wrong." End of quote. Now, this statement reveals Machiavelli's allegiance to the concept of power. Now, the question here is, what power is he referring to? And it appears that he is not talking about power. He's not talking about power in the spiritual sense. It would appear that he is talking about power in the materialistic sense, i.e., the power of a prince. Now, let's think about this logically. If the one with the most power is always right, then in this context, morality does not matter. And perhaps this is a time to ask yourself a question. does morality matter? And why? Why does morality matter? I ask these questions because our relationship with Machiavelli is often related to our relationship with morality. And at the very least, we can concede that there is something dark within the Machiavelli world. Is this a reflection of him? Is this a reflection of his society? Or is it a reflection of both? Now, the term Machiavellian is widely used. Matter of fact, I use this term regularly. And what's important is how I use the term. Now, if I say he was Machiavellian, what does that mean? From my worldview, from my perspective, Machiavellian relates to manipulation and or deception, because these two words, from my perspective, they have a relationship. And we may often correlate this word of Machiavellian to being evil. And the definition of evil in this context is morally bad. So it's morally bad with no supernatural connotation. So let's define Machiavellian courtesy of the dictionary. Quote, the use of clever but often dishonest methods that deceive people in order to win power or control. End of quote. So in very simple terms, this is dishonest methods for control. And from my view, from my perspective, this relates to manipulation and deception. So we can say that manipulation is a linguistic part of being Machiavellian, which is also a part of the Machiavelli consciousness. And we see the Machiavelli consciousness in the business world. Some may say that we see the Machiavelli consciousness also in the political world. And of course, this is the elephant in the room. But it's an elephant in the room that many of us can see. And being Machiavellian also relates to high levels of self-interest and an emphasis on power. And here's a question. Before we go to the next section, do we all have some forms of Machiavellian in us? Can we become Machiavellian in the trials and tribulations of life? Now, I feel it's important to talk about the influence of Machiavelli on Robert Greene. And in some sense, Robert Greene and Machiavelli, they have an intellectual relationship because both of their works appear to discuss the darkness of life, and they are both brutally honest. And I really like Robert Greene's work, and Robert Greene has a very impressive following. His book, 48 Laws of Power, sold 1.2 million copies in the United States since its inception. And interestingly, the Machiavelli influence can be seen in that book. And what's interesting is that Robert Greene on his YouTube channel actually has a video titled What Machiavelli Has Taught Me. So in one sense, the Machiavelli consciousness has been summoned by Robert Greene. Now both Machiavelli and Robert Greene arguably advocate the strategic use of deception, and both are honest about their deception. And there is an irony here, because in acknowledging in acknowledging the role of deception, Machiavelli and Robert Greene become authors that are honest. Now, if we accept the premise that many industries and many people are dishonest, then this trait of honesty becomes honourable. And it could be said that in a room full of people that are full of deception, someone telling the truth about that deception could be considered heroic. Now, from my perspective, Robert Greene and Machiavelli tell you the world is dark. In one sense, this is a statement. It's a mirror of the world that they live in. Actually, no, that's incorrect. In more than one sense, this reflects the mirror of the world that we live in. Now, here is an important question. Is Machiavelli evil? Or is Machiavelli morally bad? Clearly, what Machiavelli teaches can be used for immoral reasons. But who is responsible? Who is responsible in this transaction? The one that tells you how to cope in the dark world? The one that implements the deceit? Or the deceitful world itself? I think that's an interesting question. And what's also interesting is that Machiavelli was tortured. He was tortured due to a conspiracy charge. And this was done by the Medici family. And he was removed from office. And for 1 year, Machiavelli was banished. He was banished from the city. This, I think we can safely say, is where objectively Machiavelli experienced the dark side of the world. Maybe that trauma from the torture reinforced his political teachings. Perhaps this is why he stated the following, quote, "Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is safer to be feared than loved." End of quote. Now, there's an obvious question here. Why? Why would someone feel that it is safer to be feared than loved? Perhaps, just perhaps, Machiavelli's experiences taught him that lesson. Also, and ironically, I'm going to play devil's advocate, if Machiavelli was evil, why? Why would he be honest about deception? Why would he arm his reader to navigate in a subjectively cruel world? And what's interesting is that Machiavelli dedicated his book, The Prince, to the Medici family, the same family that tortured him. And it would appear that the motivation was to get back. It was to get back into the political jungle. Perhaps this is where Machiavelli felt safe and empowered. But despite his efforts, Machiavelli remained in exile. Ironically, his ideas would inspire a politics that would have a slippery relationship with morality and a slippery relationship with being honest. And that is the bigger irony, that the politicians that adopted his political philosophy were less than honest, because Machiavelli, in his writings, was very honest. In this sense, Machiavelli was not evil, but maybe, just maybe, the minds that listened to him could become evil, and those minds may be in the political circus of today. So let's review another Machiavellian idea. Quote, "The end justifies the means." End of quote. So the outcome is more important than the process. The outcome is more important than the process. Let's give an example. So let's take a boss, and he or she decides to create layoffs to save the company from losing money and ultimately going out of business. In this scenario, the end is saving money to not go out of business, and the means is ending people's jobs. Through the Machiavelli lens, the saving money would be the pivotal focus. In this example, the company survives, but certain employees can't pay their bills, and certain employees can't support their families. This is dark, and it represents the cold reality of life. And let's be honest, if a manager has empathy, it's a tough decision in just focusing on the goal of the business surviving. And I think it's important to add a level of honesty here, because business is ruthless, because business represents competition. It is literally the metaphorical representation of the strongest survive and the weakest die. Because in the business jungle, the lions, they smile. In the business jungle, it is the real representation of the wolf in sheep's clothing. Now, of course, this could be just my own personal projection, but what's your opinion? What do you think about the end justifying the means? In the business context, is it savage? Is it fair? And what does the end justifies the means mean in the political context? So I would like to conclude with the following statements. Statement number 1. The Prince is one of the most influential books of political philosophy. That in itself makes this book very important. It also represents the concept. It represents the concept of how to get power and how to sustain it. And the spirit of the book is very dark. Statement number 2. Being Machiavellian is a term that relates to dishonest methods and deception. It also reflects high levels of self-interest, which may relate to narcissism. Statement number 3. The consciousness of Machiavelli is transparently represented. It's transparently represented by the author Robert Greene. This could be seen as one master acknowledging another master. Statement number 4. Is Machiavelli evil? In a more scary sense, the people that read Machiavelli could, the operative word being could, they could become evil. They also could become masters of social intelligence, and they could also become masters of the political arena. And finally, statement 5. The end justifies the means can be considered a scary philosophy, and that's understandable. However, in the business context or in the business jungle, this is seen as acceptable. Does this mean that we are living in the times of the Machiavellian consciousness, or is this just a product of human nature? And with that being said, I sincerely hope you have enjoyed the content. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe.